Mitsubishi. 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 Mitsubishi.
Whew. All right. So apparently Mitsubishi plans on returning. Yes, that Mitsubishi. And Mitsubishi has been low-key for probably the last 7 or 8 years, roughly around since 2016. And Mitsubishi has never had the biggest presence in the American market. But in the new age of electrification, it would seem as though that Mitsubishi is trying to return and win our hearts back. If you haven't noticed, there's been a lot more dealerships popping up and a lot more Outlanders and Eclipse Crosses on the road, which the Outlander is doing exceptionally well. And it got me to thinking, is it time for them to return? Because looking back at it, I don't know, guys. What's up, guys? My name is Chris, and welcome to The Breakdown, where we talk about everything cars, news, and reviews. If you're new to the channel, welcome. If you are not, of course, welcome back. So, of course, earlier this year, Mitsubishi announced that they will be planning a return with CEO Mark Chafin, and he pretty much announced that Mitsubishi was trying to do right by us. And if you have no idea, Mitsubishi been in some shit. I had no idea. And as I got to investigating it, yeah, I see the problem. And if you're curious to know the problem too, stick around and stay tuned, because you are now watching The Breakdown. All right, getting into it. So I'm gonna go ahead and tell you this now, that before we start this, we will not necessarily be focusing on the cars. I have to be very aware in telling you guys that, and intentional. This video will not focus on the cars exclusively. I'll touch on them, but this is really company business and it's messy. So Mitsubishi earlier this year announced that they would be doing the 2030 plan, which is basically their way of bringing back Mitsubishi as a presence. Now, Mitsubishi has always had a smaller presence in the stake of the Americans in terms of notoriety, brand reputation, and they were always seen as the value brand, if you will. And when I say value brand, I mean Ford era Mazda value brand. I don't mean new Mazda brand. No, that's high luxury, that costs money. But Mitsubishi basically states that they're planning on expanding their dealer network, including a new portfolio of cars and focusing more so on electrification, as well as bringing a wider array of options for us to take into. Now, the 2030 plan pretty much is their target year, and we've seen this before with many other companies, and it doesn't surprise me since Nissan just recently announced their 2030 plan. After their alliance, it makes absolute sense, but that's not where we're going here. No, we're gonna pump the brakes on that. I gotta get y'all into this. I had no idea of the shenanigans between Mitsubishi, Chrysler, Daimler, Nissan, and Renault. It's a hoot. You had to be there. So the 1960s is where Mitsubishi, as heavy industries in Japan, kind of consolidates, and pretty much, long story short, they fuse together and become Mitsubishi Motor Corporation. As I've always said in almost every one of my videos, as I keep reflecting back into the history, the 1970s Clean Air Act, as well as the gas crisis of 1973, or the OPEC energy crisis of 1973, depending on how you want to say that, put a lot of people in very compromising positions. Now, this was an excellent opportunity for Mitsubishi, as they were trying to enter to the US market, because many of the other Japanese competitors, such as Honda, Toyota, Nissan, had already been booming in way of getting fuel efficient cars over. And so Mitsubishi decided that they were going to get a piece of the pie. Now, Mitsubishi has a huge heritage, and they had been around for quite some time. In addition to that, they also have a huge rally heritage, and so Mitsubishi, alongside Subaru, very much focused on the input of four-wheel drive, all-wheel drive. And so towards the 70s, the American car companies were really struggling to figure out what they were going to do, because when I tell you Honda and Toyota was laying a smackdown, everybody was laying a smackdown on these American car companies, and they had to do something. It was not uncommon for the big three to partner up somebody because they were desperate. And so, being that they were desperate, everybody tagged a partner. Ford tagged Mazda, and also Chrysler is the focal point of the story, because if you couldn't have picked anyone better, Chrysler was the worst one to pick. I did not know that Chrysler was that bad. Chrysler in this story is the problematic girlfriend. Baby, Chrysler was wearing their ass out. Okay, let me focus. Okay. Around 1970, Mitsubishi and Chrysler start talking, right? They start courting each other because everybody needs to tag a partner. And so Mitsubishi basically does Chrysler an agreement, and we get introduced to the Dodge Colt. Now, the Dodge Colt was basically a rebadged, re-engineered Mitsubishi. It was intentionally used as Dodge to kind of get people accustomed to the idea of driving Japanese without knowing it, which is already deceptive practices in itself, but I digress. For the first 10 years, it was cool. It was copacetic. The Colt sold great. People loved it. Absolutely love it. Great car. Fantastic car. By around 1980, it comes out that a few of the executives don't exactly like the executives over at Chrysler. So Mitsubishi on the low is not fucking with Chrysler. And I only know this because I actually looked up a few articles, and it's by word that pretty much they were hesitant given that Chrysler had so many problems. Now, around this time during the 1980s, we know that Lee Iacocca comes in and he pretty much changes Chrysler with the K cars, but that is not without the help of Mitsubishi. It comes into fruition that Chrysler has a lot of debt, and even though they bought 15% of Mitsubishi back in the 70s, it was getting a little complicated for Chrysler as they wanted to venture off and do their own brand. Now, I can attribute this to being more so the difference in management styles, and so Chrysler of the big three has always been kind of the shenanigan brand when it comes to not the products, but more so the management, culture, and the decisions that are being made to make the brand more profitable. Towards the 80s, Mitsubishi is looking at Chrysler real sideways. And what ends up happening is that they bite their teeth, they keep their head down, and by 1981, Mitsubishi Motors of North America is finally formed. Now, Chrysler didn't exactly let Mitsubishi off the hook because I believe that they still needed to use some of their engineering and developments, but apparently between Mitsubishi withholding engines and Chrysler talking shit on the low, it was a mess. Now, the story doesn't stop there. So we get some really interesting pieces from Mitsubishi, one of them being the Galant, the Montero, which of course is the SUV and was competing with a lot of off-road SUVs like Jeep. And the Montero at that time was body on frame up until later where it became unibody. And the beauty of this is that we got some great cars out of this. One of them being the Eclipse Turbo and the Plymouth Talon, as well as the Dodge Avenger. And so there were a few other cars, but a lot of the cars that you see from the K cars were just pretty much Mitsubishi technology, if you will. But many of the cars that Mitsubishi was producing were simply not lower class, but a lot of people seen them as value package brands. They didn't see them as the popularity of Toyota and Honda and even Nissan to some degree. The Mitsubishis were okay, but it became evident that Mitsubishi wasn't exactly the biggest market shareholder, and so they had to figure out to do something. Now, we're gonna pump the brakes on Mitsubishi real quick. So around 1995, Daimler begins courting the idea of we need to get outside of the luxury market because we want to create and expand and get into another whirlwind of cars. Daimler begins talking to Chrysler, and at one point, I don't know if Daimler was just thinking about Chrysler one day and said we like those cars, or logistically it was easier. I'm gonna be honest, it's probably because Chrysler was the cheapest bid to get, and so this is how we get formed shortly 3 years later. Daimler f***ing Chrysler. As Daimler Chrysler became a thing, they needed a guinea pig. They needed a flunky. They needed somebody to do the work. Now, Chrysler had a limited amount of resources because they had been struggling since 1980, especially after the government had bailed them out the first time. And Chrysler was really trying to figure out how they were going to do this. And they were courting from a engineering and logistics standpoint who they were going to pick, and rumor has it that was Honda, and Honda was like, nah, we ain't doing that. Eventually it would be carried over that Mitsubishi was third pick. The other thing is they were also courting Nissan, but Nissan apparently could not deal with the demands. Daimler was not willing to pay the billions of dollars that Nissan wanted to get started with the alliance, and so that's actually how you got the Nissan-Renault alliance in 1998. And so Daimler picks Chrysler, and Chrysler picks their third side piece girlfriend, Mitsubishi, to come back. I found it very interesting that Chrysler picked Mitsubishi again, despite the shenanigans that was happening in the early 80s. So by 2001, even though they had some interest in sharing Mitsubishi, Daimler was on a hell rant. It was real strict over there. Daimler-Benz, the first thing they did when they got with Chrysler was kill off the Plymouth brand because it was not profitable. And that was the name of the game for Daimler. If it was not profitable, get rid of it. And that's because they had been going through some financial troubles on their own. But Mitsubishi was indirectly involved with Daimler Chrysler, and Chrysler was really the one that benefited from most because they were getting the engineering technology from both and were able to put out some other products. That's actually how you got a lot of the big hits from Chrysler and Dodge. And so the biggest thing is to remember that Chrysler always had financial problems. But back to Mitsubishi, the real problem that comes along here is Mitsubishi is trying to figure it out because their market share is dwindling. They had changed over the Montero to body and frame to unibody, so that was a good idea. They also brought out the Outlander. And while these things were on the cusp of the SUV craze, it wasn't quite enough. The only thing they had really was the Lancer, the Galant, because they had just recently killed off the 3000 GT. And so maybe the Diamante at that time, but I think it was on its cusp of being on its way out. So around 2001, here's where it went to. So, well, actually, here's part one of how it went to shit. So the first thing that Mitsubishi decides is that we are going to create a $0 plan. What is that, you might ask? So a $0 plan is essentially a $0 a month, 0 down, and 0% interest for 12 months. And if you look at the reputation of Mitsubishi in comparison to Honda and Toyota, there was a type of demographic that was lured by this, and mostly subprime buyers. Subprime basically means that they either have bad credit, poor credit, and it's not entirely everybody, but a lot of the people who couldn't traditionally get into loans would ordinarily be in the 000 program. Now, there was some level of credit required to get into this program, but for the most part, they were pretty much taking everybody. And because of this, you went 12 months on the books without collecting any type of payment.
Absolute chaos.
And speaking of absolute chaos and subprime lending, this video has been brought to you by myautoloan.com. If you're somebody who enjoys buying a car but you don't necessarily like the process, myautoloan.com might just be the choice for you. And I've used myautoloan.com before, and in truth, I felt like it was a very streamlined process. It was very easy. I simply filled out my information and they matched me to the lenders that best match my credit profile. You do need a minimum credit score of 580, but that doesn't necessarily have to stop you, as there has been people who have still applied and gotten amazing deals on their car. So if this is something of interest to you, feel free to click on the link in the description below and to take you to myautoloan.com and get started on your auto loan today. With that being said, now let's get back into the video. So the 0000 was an absolute train wreck. We wouldn't really see the results of this for a couple of years later, as Daimler-Benz of Daimler Chrysler had pretty much had it up to its neck between the shenanigans of Chrysler and the shenanigans of Mitsubishi. Word on the curb is that it was a very toxic and stressful environment for both environments, and many of the automotive professionals noticed that it was incredibly difficult for the management cultures to work together, which is ultimately what led to the dissolving of Daimler Chrysler by 2006, but we're not there yet. So what really happened that really put a nail in the coffin is that Daimler Chrysler had initially invested 34% of stake into Mitsubishi. The real problem that comes in is that a recall scandal of Mitsubishi had surfaced. What happened, you might ask? Basically, they had been avoiding and dodging warranty repairs since 1977 under Code H, which is secret for tossing in the trash. And when I read this, my mouth dropped because I could not believe that. Well, I kind of can't believe it because it's not uncommon for this to happen. This is very common in the car industry. But I could not believe that that would come out after they had just invested 34%. And shortly thereafter, that no less than 2 years later, it comes up that Mitsubishi also had lost $400 some odd million in the 000, and it shot the depreciation of their products into the fucking ground. Between that and the reputation of Mitsubishi being scandalous, Daimler couldn't do it anymore, and eventually they sold off their shares to Goldman Sachs, and they were just like, we're gonna wash our hands with it. Ever since then, Mitsubishi has been on the struggle bus. Now, between 2006 and 2007 is kind of where we see a small dip in the sales, and 2007 is a resurgence, but the reason why is because we begin to see much more of Mitsubishi becoming a affordable brand. And towards the housing crisis of 2008, this also ties into why they were as big of a deal as they were, because basically people needed cars and they needed cheap cars, and this was the perfect thing. But I say all of that to say is that throughout the years between the Daimler Chrysler era as well as the Nissan Renault alliance, Mitsubishi been stale. They've been stale ever since. After the recall scandal, basically they were saying that, you know, we need to go find somebody, and they were on their last leg up until Nissan extended a hand and offered them a chance to get themselves back together. Now, tying all of this together, now that we know the entire scope of Mitsubishi, should they return to their full-fledged glory? First of all, they had no glory.
So, you have these Tupperware parties often?
But they were a decent brand that offered decent products. So it is absolutely an amazing time for Mitsubishi to come back to market, and hopefully it will help to bring some fruit of their long extended labor. But with that being said, you guys let me know in the comment section what you think about Mitsubishi returning and whether or not you think that they will do good this go around, considering the last two whoopsie daisies they've had, especially with Chrysler and Mercedes. With that being said, until the next video, I will see you guys later.